So tonight, we're going to be diving into the Gospel of Matthew. And the Gospel of Matthew is a very profound gospel that has had great significance in the history of the church. In fact, you could say in some way, one of the ways of describing the Gospel of Matthew is it really is the church's gospel par excellence, more than any of the other gospels. In fact, before the Second Vatican Council, for many centuries, Sunday Masses were primarily from the Gospel of Matthew. Mark and Luke were not used as often. The Gospel of John got plugged in different sorts of ways. But Matthew really was the primary gospel through which the church looked at the person of Jesus. And for many centuries, it was believed that Matthew was an original eyewitness, one of the 12 who followed Jesus, and that Mark was only an interpreter of Peter, and that Luke was a translator for the Gentile world, a companion of Paul. So therefore, why not take the eyewitness? The interesting thing about the last 100 years plus of what we call critical historical scholarship of the Scriptures actually has turned that whole tradition on its head. So the Gospel of Mark, the vast majority of scholars today believe was the earliest of the four Gospels written and a primary source for the Gospel of Matthew. So most biblical scholars today do not believe that the author of the Gospel was an original eyewitness to the events that took place, but bases the narrative on the sources that he had. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. If you look at the Gospel of Matthew, it is roughly 50% longer than the Gospel of Mark, more expanded. So Matthew's Gospel in Greek has a little over 18,000 words. The Gospel of Mark, by comparison, only has about a little over 11,000 words in the Greek Gospel. The things about Matthew that are very significant additions beyond the Gospel of Mark that you'll notice right away are, first of all, that Matthew does have an infancy narrative, which is not included in Mark's Gospel. Matthew also has much more extended appearances of resurrection at the end. So that's another thing you'll notice. The other thing you will notice about Matthew right away, if you read it, how many of y'all have read it, by the way, recently? Great, so some of y'all took that suggestion. You'll notice that Jesus talks a lot more than he did in Mark. So in Mark's Gospel, Mark would often tell us that Jesus taught, and he taught with authority. Whereas Matthew not only says that, but he also gives us more sermon material from Jesus. In fact, if you look at the sermons in the Gospel of Matthew, there are 5 major sermons spread throughout the Gospel. We're going to be looking at those a bit. The word church in Greek, ecclesia, appears in the Gospel of Matthew twice. It does not appear in Mark, Luke, or John. So another reason that the Gospel of Matthew is called the Gospel of the Church. And actually, one of his 5 major sermons, that is Jesus' 5 major sermons in the Gospel of Matthew, has to do with the community of the church. And that's where the term ecclesia appears in one of the 2 sections of Matthew's Gospel. So let's look real quick at the sources. The primary source for the Gospel of Matthew is the Gospel of Mark. He had probably a written copy in front of him. So the basic narrative framework of the Gospel of Matthew comes from the Gospel of Mark. So it includes about 80% of the Gospel of Mark in his Gospel. The things that he tends to leave out, he tends to shorten narratives where Mark gives a lot of very concrete details. Remember the story of the man possessed by the legion of demons. Matthew will give us a much more abridged version of that. So he tends to de-emphasize some of those more concrete descriptive elements that we find in Mark in some places. A big chunk of Matthew's Gospel, most of those 5 major sermons, comes from what scholars call the Q source, which is that what scholars believe to be a written collection of the teachings of Jesus that both Matthew and Luke had when they wrote their gospel. And as I mentioned before, Matthew and Luke both preserve teachings of Jesus not found in the Gospel of Mark that are from beginning of the gospel to end roughly in the same order, sometimes the exact same wording, but they're spread out and plugged into the gospel structure of Mark slightly differently. So it's kind of, you can tell that they had the same source, but they didn't work together, so they plugged it into their narratives in a slightly different pattern, if you want to put it that way. And then also the Gospel of Matthew contains what scholars, for lack of a better word, call Matthean material, Matthew's material. So we abbreviate it with a capital M or an MT. And so the material that's only found in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew's own special material, some of that is probably traditions, either written or oral, that Matthew had, apart from Mark and Q. Other parts of the Gospel may in fact be the composition of Matthew. So some of it may be his own composition for theological purposes rather than a source. So when you look at the sources in some detail, if you look at how Matthew uses the material from Mark, one thing that biblical scholars who know the Greek will note is that Mark was not the best user of the Greek language. So when Matthew borrows from Mark, he tends to improve the Greek of Mark. So if you were a teacher and you're correcting a student's paper and you're improving the grammar and punctuation, this is typically what Matthew does with the Greek of Mark's Gospel. He also at times clarifies. So if Mark has a vague pronoun like his house, sometimes Matthew will clarify what pronoun that's referring to. You also will not be surprised by this. One of the other key differences when Matthew takes material from Mark that has to do with the family of Jesus or the disciples, he polishes things up a bit. He makes them appear in a more positive light than Mark's Gospel did. And you will certainly see that with Simon Peter. We're going to be looking at some of Matthew's special material related to Simon Peter, very significant in the Gospel. Another dimension about Matthew is that he tends to heighten the majesty surrounding the person of Jesus. So Jesus is approached more reverentially by people in the Gospel of Matthew than he is. So Mark will use the language like they came up to Jesus, and literally that's kind of a crude English translation, whereas Matthew will say they made their approach to Jesus. So much more reverential toward the person of Jesus. And by the way, one of the stories you'll remember from the Gospel of Mark, the scribe who comes up to Jesus to say, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life?" And Mark says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." Matthew has a subtle change in that narrative. Matthew says, "Why do you ask me about what is good? No one is good but God alone." So it, again, heightens the appreciation for the dignity and the person of Jesus and his gospel. By the way, I think that's several of these changes from Mark to Matthew are easier to understand as the Christian community matures. It would be odd indeed if Mark based his gospel on Matthew and made the disciples and Jesus' family appear worse than Matthew did. And it would be strange that he would be less reverential toward Jesus if his account was based on the account of Matthew, as was believed for many centuries. What about that special material that Matthew has? Some of it we talked about already. Special material about Simon Peter. We're going to be looking at that material in the weeks to come. The material about the infancy of Jesus, which, as we saw last week, is found only in the Gospel of Matthew. The narrative of Luke is distinct from it, except for a few common motifs. I will throw one little puzzle your way. So last week when we looked at the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew with the birth and infancy of Jesus, who is the primary focus in Matthew's Gospel? Joseph, correct. Luke's Gospel, primary focus, Mary. A little puzzle, the story of the Magi. If you noticed this Sunday when we heard the story on the Feast of the Epiphany, the Magi arrived at the house where they saw the child Jesus with his mother Mary. Joseph is not mentioned in that part of the narrative. It's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it, since the rest of Matthew's infancy narrative seems more focused on Joseph, but Matthew doesn't even mention that he's there when the Magi arrive. Maybe he was in the village getting wood, I don't know, or something, shopping or something, groceries, who knows. But it's a curious little puzzle. The other thing about Matthew's Gospel, he has some unique elements, and we'll see that when we get to the death of Jesus. Pilate washes his hands of the responsibility of putting Jesus to death. That's only found in Matthew. Pilate's wife has a dream about Jesus and the Passion. Only Matthew mentions that. Another thing we often overlook it when the death of Jesus takes place, and it's only found in the Gospel of Matthew, there are earthquakes, and the dead start coming out of the tombs, rising from the dead at the death of Jesus. That's quite a puzzle. We don't usually think about dead people rising up as a result of Jesus dying before Jesus rises from the dead. So some unique elements about the Gospel of Matthew. The unique things about those sections of Matthew that stand out, whether it be the infancy or the death of Jesus, more vivid imaginary or a vivid imagination, extraordinary heavenly and earthly phenomenon. Scriptural influence is greater. And there is also in the Gospel of Matthew more hostility toward the Jewish community than we saw in Mark. If you go to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus really lets the scribes and Pharisees have it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you whitewashed tomb. You're like sepulchres over which people walk unawares. You're dead men's tombs. I mean, Jesus really lets them have it. Scholars believe that the reason because for this in Matthew's Gospel is the tension between the emerging Jewish community and Matthew's Christian community has gotten more intense. So it's kind of like family members who are fighting about something. We fight really well with family members, better than we do with strangers, don't we? So this connection with the emerging Jewish community and Matthew's own community down the street, so to speak, produces a greater degree of heat in the Gospel of Matthew. The other element which we talked about last week and we saw in the infancy narrative is Matthew likes to use quotations from the Old Testament, as it was said in the prophet. He does that a little over a dozen times in the Gospel, 8 times from the prophet Isaiah. And almost all of them seem to function in the fashion of saying, God prepared this in the Old Testament, and now see it's fulfilled right here. So the question comes up sometimes, did the quotation from Scripture lead to the creation of the narrative, or did the narrative that took place about Jesus inspire Matthew as a Christian scribe to find where something was predicted like that in the Old Testament? In most cases, it's probably that the narrative itself existed, and Matthew, as a diligent scribe, knowing well the scriptures of Israel, goes back to find those citations to support his argument that Christianity really is the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Matthew, in that sense, could be described in some ways as a worthy Christian scribe. So, in the Sermon on the Mount, we'll see Jesus, there's a reference to Jesus talking about their scribes, referring to the Jewish people scribes. So there's a self-conscious awareness by the time Matthew was written on the lips of Jesus of a distinction between the Jewish scribes and our new Christian scribal or theological tradition. Quick thing about authorship, which I mentioned before. There is a quote from Papias saying that this gospel was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, arranged in some form of order, an orderly fashion. Was that order chronological? Was it a logical order based on persuasive literary arrangement? It's not that clear, but the majority of scholars today believe that the gospel was originally written in Greek and do not necessarily detect underneath it an Aramaic original. Most of the scholars today believe that the writer is a Jewish Christian, which may seem obvious to us, but he has a Jewish background and became a Christian. But there have been actually a few scholars of Matthew that have argued that he was a Gentile or a non-Jewish Christian who knows a lot about the Jewish tradition. I tend to think, based on how immersed Matthew is in the fulfillment citations and so forth, that he was in fact a Jewish Christian. So that is his background. It's also one thing I'll mention as an aside. When you read the letters of Paul, which were written sometime before the Gospel of Matthew, and especially if you read Paul's letter to the Galatians, or even sections of his letter to the Romans, what's the attitude of Paul toward the law, the Torah, the Old Testament? Not good. Yeah. And remember that Paul was dealing with a strange circumstance. He had experienced people who accepted the gospel, that Jesus died and rose for them, and they were baptized and received the gift of the Spirit, and were not Jewish. Paul did not make them get circumcised if they were men. They did not have to follow, in Paul's view, the whole Mosaic Torah from the Old Testament. They were not bound by the law of the Old Testament in its entirety. And then some people came from Jerusalem who were associated with James, the so-called brother of the Lord, who told them, unless you follow the entire Mosaic law and get circumcised, you cannot be saved. So salvation for that group, yes, you believe in Jesus, but first you have to be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law. So Paul has some rather sharp rhetoric saying the law can't save us. You know, it's powerless to save us. Only Christ can save us. So if you don't read Paul in that historical context, Paul seems to be almost against the Jewish law. And when you get to the Gospel of Matthew, on the other hand, it seems like it's in strong tension with Paul, saying the law is worthless. So Jesus will say in the Gospel of Matthew, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Not one iota, one mark on the letter of the Torah shall be replaced until it's all fulfilled. So in Matthew's Gospel, there is a great reverence for the Torah, the Old Testament law. But Matthew is certainly not one of those Judaizers who would say without circumcision and following the whole Mosaic Torah, you cannot be saved. So Matthew would have some middle course between the Judaizers that were disturbing Paul's people and Paul's reaction to that. So Matthew is sort of, the war on that front got won by Paul gloriously. So by the time Matthew's Gospel is written, there are many Gentile Christians in the church who have not been circumcised, who are not required to follow the Mosaic law. You see the great argument in the Acts of the Apostles about that. And the apostles came to the conclusion, they said, guided by the Holy Spirit, that they had to observe a bare minimum. So no eating no meat from strangled animals, no sexual immorality. They listed 3 or 4 propositions, but not all the other ritual requirements of the Old Testament Torah. So by that point, it was a finished point. But Matthew seems to be, therefore, recovering the value of the ethical dimension of the law from the Old Testament, fulfilled in Christ. And he will present Jesus, in fact, in a sense, as a new lawgiver who transforms the law and deepens it and makes its demands even more interior and more radical in some cases. We'll be looking at that in some depth. What about this community that Matthew is writing to? Many scholars place it in Syria, specifically the city of Antioch. And Matthew tends to have a more urban community, it seems. Whereas Mark will refer to villages, Matthew will often change references from village and use the word in Greek for cities. He also tends to increase dollar amounts, so perhaps Matthew's community was used to a bit more money, especially when you put Luke and Matthew side by side. Almost any time they talk about dollar amounts, Matthew uses higher dollar amounts than Luke does in the same narrative that's unfolding. So perhaps Matthew's community was a bit more urban, probably a major Christian center where the interplay between the Jewish and Gentile Christian communities was still ongoing. Probably written after the destruction of the temple, and so by this point, the Jewish community after the destruction in Jerusalem gathered in the city of Yamnia, or Jabneh on the coast, from about 90 to 100 and 110 AD. That was critically important in the development of what we would call the Jewish religion today. So they were basically the inheritors of the Pharisaical interpretation of the Jewish traditions, since most of the priests were killed in Jerusalem, the Zealots were wiped out, the Essene communities had passed by that point, so what's left remained are the Pharisaical interpretations at that point. Around 85 AD, there was a blessing, which is actually a curse against Christians that was introduced into the Jewish synagogue worship. So that's pointing to the tensions between the emerging Jewish community and the emerging Christian community at that point. And so you'll see that a little bit in Matthew's Gospel. We'll also be looking at the connections between Moses and Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And last week we already saw that at the birth of Moses, the Pharaoh, the ruler, threatened all the babies that were being born, and Moses was miraculously kept safe by God's intervention. And you see at the time of Jesus, just like Moses, also a threat to children by the ruler, and God miraculously intervenes to save the life of Jesus by allowing them to flee to Egypt. We also see Moses leading the people from Egypt to Israel, and Jesus will repeat that journey with a return from Egypt back to the Holy Land. Also, the great place of teaching we'll see in the Gospel of Matthew is on top of a mountain, and that's where Moses first received the Torah, the law from God. So Jesus will give the new teaching from the mountaintop. And Jesus will specifically quote the commandments of Moses in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said of old, but I say to you, so as the new lawgiver, Jesus will be presented, a greater than Moses. So this conscious comparison between the greatest of all Jewish figures, Moses himself, by Matthew, with the still greater person of Jesus in his gospel. The mission to the Gentiles, by the time Matthew was written, is underway, but Matthew does preserve in his gospel, in at least two locations, the words of Jesus that he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So the mission to the Gentiles really begins for Matthew at the resurrection. Go now to all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father. That's the end of the gospel. So once the death of Jesus takes place in the resurrection, the historical ministry of Jesus that was to the lost sheep of Israel now becomes the mission to the world, basically. The other element that we saw last week, though, is that he starts the gospel with the nations coming to adore Jesus and the persons of the Magi at the beginning of the gospel. 5 times in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus talks about their synagogues, the Jewish synagogues, as opposed to us, we Christians. So that shows you that development. So by that point, Jews are already seen as other than us in the time the Gospel of Matthew is written. Are any questions about those sections? So we've done sort of an introduction, sources, authorship, and community. All right, yes.
Father, I've had this question last 2 weeks. I've never thought about this before, but what kind of religious practices did the Gentiles have before they were Christian? I mean,
All right, so
pagans, or was it a mix?
All right, so in the ancient world of the first century, there would be some people who were drawn to the Jewish religion because it was a religion that was considered ancient and highly respected. So there were non-Jews who sort of hung out with the Jewish community called God-fearers. So they would have been introduced to the sublime teachings, they would call it the sublime teachings of the Old Testament, and have come to the conviction perhaps that there was one God, and be open to the truth of Israel, but had not made the conversion to become Jewish. So that would have been a primary community that the early Christian missionaries would have spoken to. But also in the ancient world, there was still belief in what you would call the pantheon of Roman and Greek gods. And by the point that Jesus is there, a lot of times that wasn't given a lot of seriousness. Even at that point in history, many people didn't necessarily believe it was all true. Some did. There was also a cult around the emperor, and he was considered by some to be divine and worthy of worship. So that putting the political leader in a quasi-divine status. And there were also a few ancient cults, we would call them mystery religions in the first century. Some of them based on kind of religious teachings that had come from Persia, which would be modern-day Iran, Zoroastrianism, belief in a conflict between a good God and an evil God, a sense of mysterious rites that you had to engage in to become part of a secret knowledge society. So those would have been the types of currents in the ancient world. Some would have been somewhat, we would call it today, fairly skeptical of religion in the sense of anything beyond this world, and would have focused more on a philosophical way of living, like the Stoics or the Epicureans. So there were a lot of, so in that sense, the ancient world was in some ways, as a result of the spread of the Roman Empire and Greek culture, was sort of cosmopolitan. Sort of like our modern world is sort of cosmopolitan, a lot of different belief systems. So in that sense, it was right before Christianity to come along. I want to look a little bit at the principal theological themes in the Gospel of Matthew as well. So obviously, Jesus himself, the person of Jesus. By the way, when I talked about Mark's Gospel, remember I said Mark was a gospel that tried to answer 2 basic questions. Remember what those questions were? Who is this Jesus? And the second, what does it mean to follow him, to be a follower of Jesus? So those are the 2 basic questions Mark is wrestling with. If we could summarize Matthew, one way of putting it would be Matthew's gospel is really what I would call a handbook for Christian living. In other words, this community now has been Christian for a while, and we believe the good news, but are we really following it? Are we really living as Jesus wants us to live? So remember in Paul's letters, the good news of Jesus was brand new. He's risen from the dead. You believe in it now. You're set free from your sin. For Paul, the good news of the gospel was dramatic. For Matthew, it's sort of presumed. We've all accepted Jesus as Lord now. That's a fundamental part of the gospel. But are we really living the way we're supposed to live? So you'll see a strong theme in the Gospel of Matthew, where that theme comes up over and over again. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of God, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. It's like the person who builds his house on rock. You know, he puts these words of mine into practice. So in Matthew's gospel, it's almost like saying, okay, I know you all believe in Jesus, but this is what it means to believe in Jesus. This is how you have to live now as a result of your belief in him. So it's a presumption of belief already to a Christian community that is accepted, but maybe at times is becoming a little slack living the ethical call of the gospel. So Matthew is challenging his Christian community to live like they're supposed to, and then you have these stark warnings, or what will happen to you? You'll be thrown into that outer darkness. There will be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. That's one of Matthew's kind of favorite little expressions. We'll come back to that in just a second. So I mention that because as you're reading the Gospel of Matthew, you get a very different tone. So how many of y'all read the Gospel of Mark all the way through earlier this year? How many then read the Gospel of Matthew? So you notice it's a lot less urgent. You know, Mark, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he's got this sudden movement. And Matthew is much more reflective, I guess is one way of putting it. So the person of Jesus, his understanding of Christ, remember from Mark that dramatic moment, the very first time a human being recognized that Jesus is truly Son of God was on the cross, near the end of the life story of Jesus. In Matthew's Gospel, as we saw last week, that is not a secret to the human actors at all. In fact, even Joseph has a dream where an angel says to him, it is going to be the Son of God. So Matthew makes it clear by including the infancy narrative that the identity of Jesus from the very beginning, we're not waiting for the cross or the baptism of Jesus. It's from the very moment that Joseph finds out that that Mary is going to have this baby. In fact, it is the Son of God. So the theology of Matthew presumes the sonship of God and presents it in a much more explicit way than Mark did. And also, remember the dramatic turning point in the Gospel of Mark, Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And then he says, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter says, well, you're the anointed one, you're the Messiah. And Jesus says, the Son of Man is going to suffer now. Oh, God forbid that should happen. Well, in Matthew's Gospel, that moment in the Gospel is much more expanded. We're going to look at it. You are the Christ of the anointed one. You are the Son of the living God, Simon Peter will say in Matthew's Gospel. Much more dramatic. And then Jesus will say to him, you are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So you have this powerful awareness of Jesus, the sonship as the Son of God, on the lips of Simon Peter at Caesarea Philippi that you do not find in the Gospel of Mark. Also, in the infancy narrative, Jesus is given the name Emmanuel, God with us. He is, as I said, compared to Moses. He is definitely presented as the exalted Lord, Kyrios. Most of the time, the disciples call him Lord or teacher or master, whereas the opponents of Jesus almost always call him only a rabbi. I think the only disciple who doesn't call Jesus Lord in Matthew's Gospel is Judas, who betrays him. The theology of church in Matthew's Gospel, what we call ecclesiology. As I said, we're going to look at it. Matthew has an entire sermon on how to get along together in the life of the church. And he explicitly refers to it. And the unique role, which I just quoted a moment ago, that Simon Peter will play in the early Christian community. You are the rock, the keys entrusted to you, the power of binding and loosing. We'll look at that. The understanding of Matthew, of the end, what we call the study of eschatology, the end of time. As I mentioned a moment ago, Matthew's warning to the Christian community is there's going to be a judgment at the end, and you better be ready for it. You have that powerful story that we all know really well in the Gospel of Matthew. It's only found in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 24, I think it is, where all of the nations are brought before for the final judgment. And then they're going to get separated like a shepherd separates the goats from the sheep. And into one, they're going to go off into the everlasting fire. The other going to go to the kingdom of my Father. And that's all about judgment. And what's the judgment based upon? It's based upon what you have done to the least of my brothers and sisters. And that, Jesus says, you have done to me. And the paradoxical thing is, those who do the good toward their brothers and sisters in need, or those who don't do so, neither group recognizes that they're in some way serving or not serving Jesus. There is no explicit awareness. It's simply, in this perspective of the last judgment, it's whether or not we actually did or didn't do it in this life is the criteria in Matthew 25 of the final judgment. So there are notes about Matthew's gospel, and remember the story in Luke about the wedding feast. Everybody gets invited to come to this big wedding party, but the people who are invited don't show up. Well, for these reasons not. He says, well, just go out on the streets and the highways and the byways, get everybody into the wedding hall. And Luke's gospel, they get everybody into the wedding hall, and there's a big banquet, and the celebration unfolds. Well, Matthew has a very strange note on the end of his. And what's the strange note? Somebody shows up late, knocking on the door and can't get in, and then somebody else is wearing a wedding garment. They're not wearing the wedding garment they're supposed to wear. And the man says, how did you get in here? Forgetting, of course, that all these people were pulled in off the streets at the last minute without your wedding garment. Or you don't have the garment on, you're going to be kicked outside, or there's going to be darkness, and weeping and wailing, and gnashing of teeth. It's going to be like the fires, it'll come up in Matthew's Gospel more than once. It's like the fires of Gehenna. So Gehenna was on the south side of Jerusalem. There was a garbage dump in the days of Jesus that always had a fire burning. But it had been a place before that of child sacrifice. And it was considered a horrific place. So for Jesus to compare those who lose salvation to the fires of Gehenna would have had a very vivid image, and probably in the minds of Matthew's community. There's also in Matthew, though, in Mark's Gospel, remember that little apocalypse in Mark chapter 13, where Jesus talks about the Son of Man will come on the clouds of heaven at the end of time, and it's going to be like lightning from one end of the sky to the other. Matthew recognizes that the Lord who will come at the end is still with the Christian community. So at the end of Matthew's Gospel, it's not just we're going to wait for him to come back, but he says to them, know that I am with you always until the end of the age. So by the time Matthew's Gospel comes along, there's not only the expectant waiting for Jesus to come again, but an awareness that he is in the community already. Where two of you or three of you gather in my name, I'm in your midst, we hear Jesus say in the Gospel of Matthew. You don't get that in the Gospel of Mark. So the awareness that the risen Lord himself is present in the church community now in the historical world unfolding. I mentioned Matthew has a strong emphasis in his gospel on ethics, living the Christian life, stronger than any of the other gospels. Is Jesus an ethical teacher in all four gospels? Yes, for sure. He wants us to live a good life. But Matthew certainly highlights that part of Jesus, underlines it and emphasizes it. And I did mention Jesus is presented as greater than Moses. Remember that Moses, in the traditional ancient world, was seen as the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So it's no accident that Jesus the new and greater than Moses, has 5 major sermons in his gospel. So the parallels with Moses extend to that significance. Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, you might speak of him as a Messiah of word and deed. So he proclaims these great sermons, but then he goes out and he puts into practice what he speaks about. So he'll speak about living a Christian life in the Sermon on the Mount. Then he goes out and he starts doing things like healing people. He does miracles. So the Messiah of both word and deed. Are any questions about those big theological themes?
Are you saying that Matthew might have read a little more into the morality issue? Obviously, he did compared to the other authors. Is that some of his feelings and not necessarily the teaching of Jesus?
Matthew will take the Jesus tradition, and like all the Gospels, he uses that tradition for his community for a particular theological purpose. And so, if he is emphasizing the importance of living an ethically good life, and not just saying we believe in Jesus, and if he's emphasizing that that's the way we're going to be judged, it's probably because he knew that his community needed to hear that part of the Jesus message more clearly. Does that kind of answer the question?
Well, I mean, if it's inspired, spirit inspired, it would seem that, and I never thought of Jesus as a moralist, really. But it seems like Matthew is making.
Well, it depends what you mean by moralist, I guess. In all of the Gospels, Jesus is speaking about how we're called to live life in a way that befits acceptance into the kingdom. But in Mark's Gospel, we didn't get as much of the content of the ethical teaching. In Luke, we will, but Luke has his own unique way of presenting it. And Luke is more concerned about how we're treating the neediest people, the little ones. That does come through in Matthew 25, but Luke, that's a thread all throughout his gospel. John's gospel doesn't quite emphasize the whole ethical dimension as much. John does have Jesus say, love one another as I love you, but you don't get into specific ethical teachings in the Gospel of John as much. It's more of a mystical emphasis on our relationship with Christ. And it may be that, we talk about this as the inspired Word of God, that at different points in our life, we need to hear different dimensions of the gospel message. So at some point, perhaps God is reminding us that we're called to a closeness with His Son, as John emphasizes. At another point, we might need to remember that that closeness to Jesus has consequences for the way that we're called to live life together in the Christian community. So we can always find something for our own personal. God will use the Scriptures for our personal moral and spiritual edification.
Do you think Matthew was aware of any of Paul's letters, since Paul's letters were written earlier?
I would say that chances are good that some of the letters of Paul were already in circulation by the time Matthew's Gospel was written, and that he would have known about some of the themes of Paul's letters. I can't say that there is a direct, off the top of my head, I'm not aware of a direct reference from Matthew to a letter of Paul, for example. But if Matthew is aware of Paul's teaching on the law, he may be trying to balance it out a bit.
Have you ever heard some Jewish scholars feel that the meeting in Joppa, the reorganization of the synagogue, did not happen?
Oh, that they feel it didn't happen at all?
Amy Jo Lee.
Oh, she doesn't feel like it happened? Oh, interesting. Oh, interesting. Yeah. The question was that some Jewish scholars do not believe that the reorganization of Judaism in Jamnia actually happened. But certainly, there is a bridge between what you might call the faith of Israel in the ancient world, first century Judaism, and modern Judaism. And modern Judaism doesn't follow all the strands of the first century. It's typically not zealot in orientation. Well, some would say, maybe the nation state of Israel might be today. It's not typically a scene in its approach. It does tend, we're Sadducean in its approach. It does tend to follow from the Pharisaical strands, more so. But A.J. Levine is one of the best Jewish scholars out there today, so I would put a lot of credence in her insights. Have you all ever heard of this company called the Grade Courses, the teaching company that has like college level courses in a lot of different fields of thought? So they actually have some interesting ones on Old and New Testament, and A.J. Levine does a series on the Old Testament that's extremely well done. If you want to know a Jewish perspective on the Old Testament. And Luke Timothy Johnson does a series on the Gospels that is fantastic from a Christian perspective, a believing Christian perspective. There's another fellow by the name of, I think it's Bart Ehrman, who is not a believing Christian, who presents Christian New Testament and history in that company. That's not very well done in my view. But Luke Timothy Johnson, if you like listening to audio recordings on the Gospels or watch video recordings, has some great insights. The Great Courses is the name of it. The Teaching Company is the company. You can find them online these days. All right. So normally at this point what I would do is jump into a look at the first sermon on Jesus, but I'm not sure we want to dive into the Sermon on the Mount tonight. We're ending a little early. Unless you all have questions, we'll save the Sermon on the Mount for next week. All right, well, let's just close with the Lord's Prayer. We're going to pray the version that is found in the Gospel of Matthew. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from